Let's now speak to Parmi Natesan, CEO of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and Tshepo Matseba, Managing Director at Reputation First. Thank you so much to you both for your time. Tshepo, let me start with you. In the context of the latest turn of events in this particular story, how has the South African brand fared in the last few days?
Yeah, it's very difficult because we come on the back of allegations of state capture and inquiry into state capture, which had to do with a lot of governance issues and serious allegations of corruption across the board, including corruption in the private sector. And so what this has done is simply to reinforce the perceptions that you see in the Perceptions Index study, which shows that South Africa is number 72 out of about 180 countries in terms of its performance around corruption. So how we are perceived around the world as a corrupt country. And when you have allegations that we are about to spend $1 billion in such an irrational fashion on a sponsorship or a partnership to promote the country in a market where we are strong and where we are known, to promote the country through a relatively poorly performing soccer team. That sponsorship sends chilling signals, and it reinforces the negative perception that we are indeed a corrupt country, even though some may argue that we are not the most corrupt and the least corrupt, but we are somewhere in the middle. But we know that in the stock market, in the world of business, perceptions do drive markets.
And Parmi, when one looks at, this particular story and the deal, and maybe they're not aware as to what the board would have needed to do in this particular context, what would have been the function of the board when you look at this particular story?
I think it's important to just understand the context. The directors of a board are appointed by shareholders, and in the case of the public sector, the shareholder is government represented by a minister, and they're accountable to and answerable to that shareholder. But whilst they're in the position that they're in, they have a legal duty to act in the best interest of the company. We must remember that a company is a juristic person. It cannot make decisions for itself, and that's why we have directors to apply their minds and their judgment and make decisions that they believe are best for the company. Obviously, business is about taking risk for reward. So that means that sometimes they're going to make decisions that are wrong and turn out to be wrong. But that doesn't necessarily mean the directors are guilty or negligent in their duty. So what needs to be proven really is that, one, the directors had all the information that they needed in order to make this decision. And if they didn't, that they asked for it. Two, that they had a rational reason to believe that this decision was in the best interest of the company. And three, that they weren't conflicted, or if they were conflicted, they disclosed that conflict and recused themselves from that decision. And that's really what's required in terms of the law. We must also understand that board decisions are collective decisions. So sometimes we as the public want to hold every board member to account, but we don't know necessarily when that decision was made, who in the boardroom dissented, as in didn't agree with the decision and noted the dissent, and usually that will be minuted in the company records. So I think it's important just to have that context with.
And Parmi, I suppose then it would be then read in the context of what you've just explained, when you read the statement that they put out, that joint statement where they talk about, the fact that, the difference of opinion came into the picture here and all of that. So certainly with what you're saying, we then can understand why it was important for them to make that distinction in that particular statement.
Absolutely. There are various reasons why people may resign. Sometimes they don't agree with the strategy. Sometimes they can't accept or come to terms with the decision that was made that they possibly didn't agree with. Oftentimes in the public sector, you'll see cases of board members' hands being tied because of shareholder interference. But I also note that the minister put out a statement to say that the board acted independently in this decision and they did not influence it. Sometimes people resign because there's a reputational risk. Sometimes they were asked to leave because they knew they would be removed if they didn't resign. So there's all these reasons. I think what you raise around difference of opinion is important because fundamentally the board must be on the same page in terms of the strategy and where the organization is going.
I'm going to come back to something else that I saw in their statement that the viewers possibly may need clarity on. But Tshepo, let me come back to you. This particular matter and how it's been handled in the public domain. I mean, we've seen different installments, including, that press briefing that we then saw, where some of them were talking about the tone. But I'd like us to talk about this particular one. The president, saying that this deal may not be justified, kind of signaling to a lot of people that the plug was going to have to be pulled on this particular one. The minister at the same time not having much to say about the actual deal itself in public. How does that look?
Yeah, there has been mixed messages from the outset, I must say, since that press conference, because even at the press conference, the press statement or the media statement was still being drafted. And that was the information that was being conveyed in the middle of that conference. The second really difficulty was that the ministry said, well, we are not responsible for this, we were not briefed. But they are accountable to us, and at some point we'll have a discussion. And yesterday, something else, or this morning perhaps, something else came out, which said from the ministry, the spokesperson, one of the spokespersons said, well, the directors that resigned, some of them, one or two of them, may actually be implicated in one or so wrongdoing, and therefore they resigned because they knew something was coming. So there's all these dynamics that are unfolding, and then the president, of course, or the presidency have been very clear on this one with a single statement that says this is just probably not justifiable or viable. But the problem is that there's just so many mixed messages, and then there was talk in that conference, besides all the optics about the CEO or the acting CEO being a bit aggressive, perhaps, or even more confident, some may say. But there were talks that, well, he says there is no intermediary involved. The deal is between the soccer team in the PSL in the UK, EPL, and South African Tourism. But it later occurred that actually there is an intermediary. There is an agency involved. And so now it begins to bring up questions about truthfulness, trustworthiness, and the credibility to the entire process. And especially when you're receiving pieces of information, it almost seems like we are reacting. One of the analysts in the US, or if not the UK, said actually they have very close sources in that country who can testify, who say that there was actually an event that Tottenham Hotspur had scheduled already where this week, where this was about to be launched and unleashed. And so some of the story and the narrative that comes out tells you that this was actually far off in the game, and some people were caught with the tail between their legs, and that's not how you would handle and should handle a crisis in the middle of additional crises that South Africa is facing currently. So beyond being sort of tone deaf and a little bit aggressive, there are also a plethora of a mixture of information that is actually creating more chaos and more misunderstanding.
Parmi, when one was reading, that joint statement, there's something that really, piqued at me, and it says that the former board members have a fiduciary responsibility to hold confidential information obtained during their board service and would not be available for further comment on the matter. Does it then mean that they could never be in a position to spill the beans and say exactly what happened here? How do you balance between the truth coming out to members of the public who so want to hear it, and also being loyal to the board and the company you were serving?
Yeah, so part of a director's legal duty is to maintain confidentiality. And I don't think that goes away when someone has resigned from a board. Like any other profession, the confidentiality still exists. I think, what's important here is that we as the public have questions, and who do we need to get answers from? It's not necessarily these former board members, it's the company itself. Every organization has stakeholders that it needs to keep on its side. It needs to understand the needs, interests, and expectations of these stakeholders in order for the company to operate legitimately. And in the public sector, we as the public are a stakeholder of this organization, and we have questions. I think the company needs to be answerable to the public, and not necessarily the former directors, who are bound by confidentiality. The only time that they could disclose confidential information that they learned during their tenure is if there's a legal or other formal proceeding, like an inquiry or commission, etc.
All right, it's going to be interesting then to see what happens on this one. Thank you so much to you both for your time. Really do appreciate it. That is Parmi Natesan, CEO of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and Tshepo Matseba, Managing Director at Reputation First.